there is a lot of human capital here, which is very interesting and that can be leveraged internationally. Argentina is a huge promise of natural resources. You have a minery, you have oil, you have gas. I mean, the problem is how much you can trust in the long term. And that's always the same question because things change, laws change.
I'm Aoife Devitt, and welcome to the 50 Faces podcast, a podcast committed to revealing the richness and diversity of the world of investment by focusing on its people and their stories. I'm joined today by Fernando Bonardi, who is based in Buenos Aires and currently working as a financial advisor in the wealth area. Prior to this, he worked for 17 years as head of investment management distribution for Latin America for BNY Mellon Investment Management, and prior to that, held a series of roles in investment consulting, as a credit analyst and as an economist. Welcome, Fernando. Thanks for joining me today.
Oh, thank you.
Well, when we caught up over the phone and I was in Buenos Aires, we got to know each other, and that was wonderful. I'd love to now, for the purposes of the podcast, briefly trace your career trajectory. And while we do that, maybe if you can paint a picture of what the economic backdrop was like as you were making all of these moves.
It's been a long time, my career. I'm about to be 60 years old now. In fact, coincidentally, in my last holiday with my family, my older son, who is 21, asked me the same question. Why don't we go through your career? Basically, because he's trying to imagine how to build his own career. And then I started to answer this same question and going through, and it's so many things that happen, no? But the summary is I'm an economist. I did an MBA here in Argentina at SEMA, who is a very well-known institution here. Then I specialized in finance, doing several different seminars and attending other universities. And then I started my career first investigating as an economist in institutions like FIEL, which is Fundación de Investigaciones Económicas Latinoamericanas. It's a very well-known entity here in Buenos Aires, a think tank, where I met some of my mentors. One of them is Isidro Zoloaga, who is a very good economist now living in Mexico. Then from there, I did my MBA, and then I moved into Citibank, where I had a 2 to 3 year experience in credit, and that was my first corporate finance situation. But was very interesting because everything shapes your profile gradually. So you're a bit of everything of what you've been seeing. And from there, I was invited to join a wealth management broker dealer with whom I worked for 3 to 4 years. That was my first experience in wealth management. It was very interesting. In the middle, I went to Barcelona to live 1 year to also do some corporate trust experience. And back in Buenos Aires, I was doing product picking for this entity. When I was doing product picking, I started to meet with several international fund managers. One of them was Newton Fund Manager, which was the way through which I got into BNY Mellon, because 2 years later, Mellon acquired Newton, then BNY merged with Mellon. And during all that period, that was like 17 to 20 years, I represented this company in the asset management business in Latin America. That's basically the summary of who I am. And in fact, I would say that it was 17 years working on the corporation. But the truth is that Newton, then Mellon, and then BNY Mellon are very different animals. No matter they are on the asset management, asset custody, corporate trust business, I had to adapt the culture of what I was doing in the region to that entity, to the different line of businesses, and to the different regulations along the region. In the middle of this, we had so many problems in Argentina that we can talk about that later, that one of the things I had to do is to migrate the business from Argentina, because we had the regional office here, which I represented. Then it was Mellon. I had to move that to Chile, to Santiago, where we already had a joint venture with one of the main banks in Chile, which is Banco Vice. I was director of some of their asset management business, and we moved the representation office into Santiago. We were 6 years there. My 2 first sons were born there, so I do have a root in Chile too. It was a very, very interesting experience because Chile was a much more developed country in terms of what was going on there. After that, things happened. But anyway, that was a very good experience. And there, basically, I was dealing with all the institutional investors along the region from Santiago into the countries, essentially, which were developing pension funds. As you know, Chile is a pioneer in the Latin American region of the pension fund, private pension fund system, which are called AFPs. After Chile, Peru became a player, Mexico became a player, Argentina too, but after that, Argentina nationalized the whole thing because of political ideology. Brazil is always a different animal, but we were also managing Brazil together with our team in Brazil for trying to do business there. At some point, I decided to come back to Buenos Aires. That was when BNY merged with Mellon. BNY had a rep office in Buenos Aires, so I jumped back again here because I wanted my kids to be closer to the family. And that's basically the summary of what happened. After so much time, I decided to go into a different stage of my life, getting away from the corporate business, avoiding 5-year plans and budgetings and compliances, and started my own consultancy business now, helping people who need advisory.
I'm sure you've seen some very interesting changes throughout that career and between changing countries, and as well as, I suppose, appetite ebbing and flowing from the corporates to do business in Latin America, as well as from maybe the international community as well. I'd love to ask then, so we sort of touched on, but didn't exactly describe some of the market volatility that was going on in the background. I always like to ask, when someone has that as a background, how does that shape you as a professional? How do you think about risk? How do you think about certainty, what we know? And given you work with private individuals now and wealthy individuals, how do you think it shapes them?
Well, it's a good question. I tend to say that Argentina is an amazing lab. Yeah, it's a laboratory where you can learn a lot of things, essentially what shouldn't be done. I mean, if you want to imagine how bad things can go on in a situation where you have a lot of disruptions and politics and, I'm afraid to say, corruption too, you have to be all the time rebuilding and trying to reshape what you're doing. And that applies not only to asset managers, it applies also to anything, anyone. So you get used to this. And then the reinvention rate is amazing. This is why, if you look around in the world, you will find a lot of senior executives working in different corporations at very senior levels. Maybe not so much now, but some time ago, it was very, very useful that you would find people in senior levels from Argentina. And that's basically because we are forced to deal with uncertainty. And the uncertainty is as big as you want. And that makes you prevent how bad things can go. Just to give you an idea, I can write a book about all the things that happen here. But I mean, at some point, I was telling you I had to move our Mellon rep office business from Buenos Aires to Santiago. And I was like 3 or 4 months trying to explain my compliance and finance team in London why they shouldn't send the money to pay the rent and the salaries. And when I was trying to explain that, I would say, guys, if you send the money for me to pay the rent and the salaries, that money will be freeze at the bank. Oh, but by who? By the government. So try to imagine, I mean, you are an English compliance person, no matter they already know a little bit about the whole thing, and trying to understand how bad things can go on. And even it was interesting because then was De La Rua president and the Ministry of Finance was Cavallo, who is a well-known economist here. So the Congress approved an emergency law saying that the money in the banks of the private people belonged to them. So basically it was a law saying private property is private. So, I mean, that is a good example for you to understand why people usually don't have money in the banks here. And why Argentinians have $300 billion abroad. Many of that's not money laundered and that's not money illegal. A lot of that is declared here for fiscal purposes, not all, because obviously you never know who will ask you to bring the money back and force you to do something you don't want to do. But, I mean, that's something that President Milei was right to say. So he said when he was part of his campaign, hey, look, I do understand and I do support all the people who fortunately could get their money out from Argentina before they were cheated. So we were cheated so many times that you would be surprised. And being 60 years old, I've been like 3 or 4 times in those extreme situations. We had hyperinflation 2 times. We had the deposits taken out from our banks more than once, refinance your money market deposit into 10 years against sovereign bond, who suddenly was 20% of their face value. So back to your question, you get used to these type of things, and then you learn a lot on how bad things can go.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. And I think what I'm taking from it is certainly the once bitten, twice shy adage that you don't take anything for granted, perhaps a lack of trust, but at the same time, a remarkable agility and an ability to deal with uncertainty, to pivot, and this reinvention, which I think could be very powerful as we look to the future now. And that brings me to the present and the future. And I'd love to ask, because you're on the ground and I was on the ground briefly, what do you think is maybe on the ground that from the outside we're not appreciating? And we're not maybe giving Argentina credit for? It could be positive or negative. Maybe there's something that we think is positive, but is actually quite negative. And I could cycle through many things, such as perhaps the relative independence of institutions, the low levels of debt, the fact that you're monetizing natural resources better, and maybe the effectiveness of some of the Malay reforms.
I wouldn't say that it's not something that people don't know abroad about Argentinians, but it's a twofold thing. So on one side, you see that you need creativity to be able to develop your career here and your company, your product, in order to defend from what's going on and what could happen with the next creative politician that will come here to do populism. But basically, this is a country, and that's quite along the region, where populism is much more important than long term. And when you live in a place where you know that governments are thinking on how to go through and how to progress themselves and not think about investing in the real future, then there's a very clear example here. Why Argentinian pension funds that were similar to the Chileans were privatized when they were like, it was early stages, like they were like 25, $30 billion, which is a nice number. Yeah, but that was private. Do you know how long it took to the government and the Congress, which was obviously partner of the government? It took 1 week. There was a 1 week debate to nationalize 25 billion US dollars in assets from private people. So the twofold was saying, on one side, you get used to this way of living. On the other side, the human capital is very, very, very strong. And that's more or less the same I was telling you before. An example, when I moved to Chile, it was a big, big shakeout here. And in Chile, the purchasing power was much higher because of the strong devaluation here. So all the Chilean companies were trying to tempt senior executives from Argentina to move to Chile. And it was not only financial work, it was the creativity directors from publishing companies, which had a lot of international awards. So they're basically saying, okay, you're making $2,000 in Argentina, in Chile we'll make twice as much. And it was amazing all the talent that suddenly was imported into Chile from Argentina. So back to your question, there is a lot of human capital here, which is very interesting and that can be leveraged internationally. Argentina is a huge promise of natural resources. You have a minery, you have oil, you have gas. I mean, the problem is how much you can trust in the long term. And that's always the same question because things change, laws change. We have a lot of legal problems. For instance, we had the water utility, which was owned by Aguas de Barcelona, which is part of a Leonel de Sol. They were basically contracted for a 30-year contract to deal with the water facilities in Buenos Aires. And that was nationalized just like this. And so, the level of certainty that you can have as an investor is usually very low. Can that change? Yes, it can change. That's why Milei suddenly won in such a short time of period. But will that keep like that? Who knows?
And I suppose just to conclude that question, it seems like, do you think we're properly pricing the risk? Obviously, there is a certain amount of geopolitical risk in Argentina, given this electoral uncertainty. I'd say that risk has been priced fairly highly at the moment. Do you think that investors have it right, or maybe overly optimistic or overly pessimistic?
I cannot say it's overpriced, the risk. I believe that our curriculum, our CV, basically tells everybody, be careful with those guys. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And now you're a little bit like seeing this. We are in the middle of the midterm election, and you're seeing all these scandals that who knows what of that is true and what not. But typically here, I don't know if this is something that happens everywhere a little bit, but here, the corruption exceeds one government, because in order to do business in Argentina, you need to be dealing with that. And in order to do politics in Argentina, you need to deal with that. So unions and companies and, all the environment here needs to be somehow partnering the way of doing business. So you can say, no, I will not deal with that, and then you're out. Or you can say, I will be as prudent as possible, but then you're in. Back to your question, the risk, I think, is well priced and needs much more time to make sure that can go down to even to other LATAM countries levels, because we were very close to hyperinflation just a few months ago. Now, look at this. The people who are trying to come back into the government, which are the Kirchners and the Peronists, are the same guys that were essentially provoking the hyperinflation scenario just a few months ago. And one of them is the governor of Buenos Aires province. So what's the message? It's really interesting. The economic team working with Milei is really, really very good, particularly Sturzenegger, Caputo, who used to be a trader, but he's a very good economist, Santi Mausili, who is part of the central bank. I know some of these guys, and I can tell you that the day any of those leave the government, then that's over. It's a signal to follow.
So all to play for, it seems still, as we watch the unfolding election outcomes. And I think we're early days, I think is probably, there is a tendency sometimes to wish to kind of put a country in a box or suggest that a change will be easy and straightforward. And I think that's a very good description of the nuance. I'd love to just move to some personal reflections now to conclude. So we've spoken about some of the setbacks, I suppose, in your career, some of which were dictated by circumstance. Are there any lessons learned or that you can leave us with, or any words of wisdom from some of these experiences that you could share?
Lessons of my career, I would say, keep consistent, but also be open-minded. Because sometimes in my personal situation, I did have some convictions that needed to be refurbished. So yes, I think that's something very important. Also to make sure that to keep healthy habits. Usually you are so embedded on what you're doing that's very common all around the business. You get more realistic on that once you leave the hyperactive business type. But yes, listen. It's very important to listen, to be open-minded. I wouldn't say that those were things that meant backdrops in my career, but when I recall some circumstances, I see that I should have been a little more open-minded on some of the things.
So would you have any advice for your younger self?
Well, yes. I would say I had this question back to my oldest son, who is 21, and essentially was saying, keep alert and to make the right choices. That's essentially what I would say to myself. Be selective on your relationships and relax, because things will happen. Don't be so worried about being so anxious on your career. That's basically what I would suggest.
Thank you so much, Fernando, for sharing a snapshot of Argentina today, as well as describing your career. And I should note here for those listeners that speak Spanish that you will be one of our first guests in our inaugural Spanish speaking series. And there'll be probably some variation on the theme in that. I think your clients are lucky to have somebody as seasoned as you in terms of your realistic outlook among changing times, which continue to be changing and volatile. So thank you for coming here and sharing your insights with us.
Okay, thank to you. And don't think I'm very, very pessimistic. I really trust things will improve here, but we have to keep it going.
With a dose of realism. I see that. Thank you. I'm Aoife Devitt. Thank you for listening to the 50 Faces podcast. If you liked what you heard and would like to tune in to hear more inspiring investors and their personal journeys, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. You can find all of our content on the 50 Faces Hub, where you'll find a library of role models, resources, and other solutions to enhance your career. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment advice, and all views are personal and should not be attributed to the organisations and affiliations of the host or any guest.